Alright, so this is going to be our final video for Chapter 10. We're going to be looking at Objectives 9 and 10. And at this point, we're still kind of talking about muscles on a larger scale. And so one thing that we've seen over and over and over again is that term ATP. And so in order for muscles to contract, they must have energy. And the energy that they need is called ATP. Now, I think it's important that we understand what ATP is. And so here's a molecule over here, ATP. It's a nucleotide. It has a sugar, it has a nitrogen base, but it has 3 phosphates. And so that's where it gets its name, is adenosine triphosphate. So ATP has 3 phosphates. And the way that we get energy from this molecule is when that 3rd phosphate breaks off. And so essentially what we have here are 3 negatively charged particles. So we have a negative bonded to a negative, bonded to a negative. And you may understand that like attractions don't go together. Normally opposites attract. And so we kind of have this very unstable molecule, okay? And so what will happen is that 3rd phosphate will break off, and when that happens, we can see that energy is released when that 3rd phosphate is broken. Now when that happens, it's no longer ATP, a triphosphate, it becomes ADP, a diphosphate. Now the issue is, how do we make ATP, okay? How do we make ATP that our cells can use? Well, we actually have to add that phosphate back on to ADP, and that's how we make this molecule. So when we add the phosphate, it stores energy. When we break the phosphate, it releases energy. And so we have this constant cycle of ATP to ADP back to ATP. Now the thing is this molecule is unstable, okay? So muscles cannot store ATP for very long. So because it's unstable, it's pretty much made and then broken, made and then broken, made and then broken. And so there's a very small amount, very, very low amount of ATP that's actually hanging out in the muscles at any given time. And so what happens is we have to constantly regenerate the ATP, and we have to replace that ATP that is being broken very quickly. Now, there's 3 main ways that we make this ATP. We have a creatine phosphate metabolism. Remember, metabolism is just chemical reactions. We have anaerobic respiration, or we have aerobic respiration. And so kind of the first way that we make ATP is through creatine phosphate metabolism. And so in a resting muscle, we have this substance called creatine. And what happens is that ATP is going to transfer its energy to creatine. So essentially, that phosphate is going to be added to the creatine, and that produces creatine phosphate as well as ADP. So when that ATP transfers that phosphate onto creatine, it becomes creatine phosphate along with an ADP. Now, the creatine phosphate can be stored a little bit longer than that ATP. So these molecules can accumulate in the muscle fibers, and they kind of act as an energy reserve. Now, the only problem is they can only reserve so much, okay? So when the muscle does need that energy, it's going to essentially take that phosphate off, and it's going to turn ADP into ATP, but then it's going to be left with the creatine that we started with. So this can actually only power about the first few seconds of muscle contraction, up to about 15 seconds worth of muscle contraction. So it is a great first line of ATP. So we store the phosphate with creatine. When we need it, we move that phosphate to the muscle cell, and the creatine is regenerated, and then we get some ATP out of the deal. But once again, it can only last for a short period of time. So when we need more energy, we're going to turn to these other pathways, either aerobic or anaerobic. Now, aerobic equals oxygen. You put an A or an N in front of something, it means no oxygen. So anaerobic does not require oxygen. And this is actually not a very efficient process, okay? This is not the one that we're doing most of the time. In fact, we cannot survive off of anaerobic respiration. We are going to be making ATP, but we're only making 2 ATP per glucose. And so what happens is this process called glycolysis. And in glycolysis, glucose, which is a sugar, is broken down into these substances called 2-pyruvates. So glucose is one of our monosaccharides. This is why we say carbs are energy, because we use them to make ATP. And so glucose is broken down into pyruvates. Now, we get a whopping 2 ATP from that process. Now that's not a lot, okay? Muscles need millions of ATPs per second, and so 2 is not very many, but 2 is better than nothing. Now, in order to keep doing this process, in order to keep doing glycolysis and getting 2 ATP at a time, we have to recycle these things called electron carriers. Now, you don't really have to know the details of this, but just know that in order to continue glycolysis, lactic acid fermentation is going to happen. In fermentation, there's actually 2 types. There's also alcoholic fermentation, which is how we make alcohol, like with yeast, and make wines and beer and things like that. That kind of fermentation does not happen in our bodies. In our muscle cells, we have lactic acid fermentation, which is where those pyruvates are turned into lactic acid, and that recycles those electron carriers so that we can keep doing glycolysis and getting 2 ATP, 2 ATP, 2 ATP at a time, okay? So if oxygen is not available, we're going to get lactic acid, which is going to allow glycolysis to continue. We call this lactic acid fermentation. Now, we only do this during times of need, strenuous exercise times. We don't do this on a regular basis because, once again, it's not very efficient. And so during really, really strenuous exercises, or like in your big muscles, and if you've ever been sore after a workout, it's because lactic acid will build up in your muscles. It can lead to muscle fatigue, and it can make you feel sore the next day. Now, one of the main ways that we generate energy is through aerobic respiration. So where anaerobic did not use oxygen, aerobic does. And this right here is why we have to breathe in oxygen. We have to breathe in oxygen for this process. Okay, this is the process of cellular respiration, which we've seen before. We've seen this in other lessons this semester. And cellular respiration is the process of making ATP from the breakdown of glucose in the presence of oxygen. Okay, so here's our formula. We have glucose, those sugars, plus oxygen. This is why we exhale carbon dioxide, and this is the main way that we make ATP. And so this is a lot more efficient. In anaerobic, we got 2 ATP per glucose. Here we're getting approximately 36 per glucose, which is a lot more, okay? Now, cellular respiration begins with glycolysis, that same process that we saw with fermentation. But if oxygen's present, this is when those pyruvates will enter the mitochondria. This is why we say the mitochondria is the powerhouse, because it's inside of the mitochondria where these processes are happening. And notice we're producing a lot more ATP. Okay, we're getting a lot more bang for our buck here, and it's much more efficient. So we start with the creatine phosphate metabolism. That powers the first few seconds. Then we're going to start relying on aerobic respiration, which is going to help our muscle cells make a whole lot of ATP. Now, 36 may not sound like a lot when you need millions, but keep in mind there's lots of mitochondria, there's lots of glucose, all within our muscle cells. Now, this is also how we generate a lot of heat. So if you think back to one of our first videos about muscles, one of their main functions is that they help generate body heat. And they do that through these chemical reactions. So actually in this process here, a lot of times you'll see plus heat. So not only does this reaction produce energy in the form of ATP, but it also produces energy in the form of heat. And so when we have all these muscle contractions happening, this aerobic respiration is happening, then in those processes, heat is going to be generated, which is why when you exercise, you get warmer because you have more of those chemical reactions and you have more of that heat being given off. And so this is how we kind of maintain normal body temperature just in day to day without even working out. But this is also why we get hot when we exercise. Okay, the body temp rises. And this is where we see homeostasis. Okay, this is what's going to trigger us to sweat and those blood vessels to dilate. In our skin, it helps kind of bring us back to normal. We also see this when our bodies get cold. Our nervous system will tell us to shiver. And shivering is just rapid muscle contractions. So once again, we have heat being produced because metabolism is happening. Those chemical reactions are happening. And so the contractions in those muscles is going to increase heat production, and that's going to help bring our body temperature back up. So through muscle metabolism, we generate lots of heat to help not only maintain body temperature, but also help us maintain our temperature feedback and homeostasis. And the last bit of chapter 10 is just what happens when we age. So essentially what happens is our muscles decline, okay? We have reduced muscle mass. It actually starts around age 25. By the time you're up into your 80s, you've lost about 50% of your muscle mass. Some of this can be helped if you do weight lift and exercise and stay active. It can help slow down the loss, but just aging in general is going to cause a loss of muscle mass. We can increase the time it takes to contract, and so it makes the stimulation happens more slowly, and so we don't have as fast of reaction times. We could also have reduced stamina. You know, a lot of times if you are older, you just can't do things the way you used to. It does take longer to recover after you do have a workout. It's a lot harder to get out of that bed when you're 40 versus 19. The surface area of your neuromuscular junctions decreases, which is going to decrease that stimulation. And you also have a decrease in the number of motor neurons. And so all of this is going to lead to a lessening of your muscle function and a lessening of your muscle tissue as a whole. All right, so that finishes up chapter 10. I've got some videos that you can watch, and there's also some other videos that are posted in Moodle, so I would encourage you to do that. And then if you haven't already, don't forget to do the activities on Moodle as well as the lecture test over chapter 10. So good luck, and let me know if you have any questions.